in the Idaho murders involving Bryan Kohberger, who's charged in those murders. And the latest in the investigation, Bryan Kohberger's defense team was required to submit an alibi on his behalf for the night that the 4 students at the University of Idaho were murdered. The deadline was Monday, but court documents show that Kogberger has chosen to remain silent. Let's now talk more about this and bring in defense attorney Jacqueline Goodman. Jacqueline, help us understand what this means here, and thank you for being with us. What does this mean that they're implying that there is an alibi, but they're not releasing it? Can you explain how this process works from here?
We don't want trials to be a complete ambush. We want to give notice with both sides giving each other a fair opportunity to meet the allegations. It is the prosecution's burden to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's the defendant's right to remain silent. And so we have to sort of, put those ideas together and find a common ground. So in Idaho, they do require that the defense give notice of an intention to bring an alibi defense. And so what the defense did in this case is they brought some information that they may, by their July 25th deadline, that they may bring an alibi defense, and by way of expert testimony, which we assume is going to be something like cell phone tower information, et cetera, or DNA information, et cetera, as well as cross-examination of the witnesses against Mr. Kogberger. So it is sort of they're striking a balance between giving too much information and actually saying there's no way that we're bringing an alibi defense. But this is a fairly early stage in a very, very serious capital murder case. And so that's not a surprising filing when you see that.
Okay, so we have the court documents here, Jacqueline. So let's talk a little bit more about what it says. They say, quote, evidence corroborating Mr. Kogberger being at a location other than the King Road address will be disclosed pursuant to discovery and evidentiary rules as well as statutory requirements. So let's say that Kogberger does have a legitimate alibi. Wouldn't that be easy information to submit to the court, or how does the timeline, if at all, play a role here? Is it with them having to wait a little bit more time to submit an alibi or to make that information known? Does that have any sort of role in this when you look at the timeline as a whole, waiting longer as opposed to doing it right away?
So that's sort of, it's burden shifting when you think about it in that way. It isn't the defendant's duty to say affirmatively, I was at this place or that place, although that is kind of, the extreme idea of what an alibi is. But there's also this sort of gray area where it is, if you weren't the one that did this, then you were maybe by definition not in the home at the time of these 4 murders. You might have been someplace else. And if the evidence to the defense, who's got investigators working on this, finds evidence that would indicate that it was not Mr. Kogberger who was in that home at that time, they could over time develop what amounts to an alibi defense. So it's sort of, it's more of a continuum and less of an extreme.
Okay, sure. So how likely is it, in your opinion, that there is a valid alibi here, considering the evidence that we know has been brought forth so far, the cell phone evidence, the pings, his car being captured on footage, and then, of course, arguably the largest piece of evidence, his DNA being found on the knife sheath under one of the victims' bodies. How likely is it that there could be a good, valid alibi here?
It's really hard to speculate. What we've seen and what's been in the news is clearly pointing to Mr. Kogberger being at the scene and having committed these murders. But in a case like this, you have evidence that's going to be admissible in court, and it's going to be subject to cross-examination and really sort of the sanitizing aspects of a trial so that we can get to the bottom of it. We know only a little bit. So if there is evidence that Mr. Kogberger himself was not present at the time, I mean, there are some gaps, let's face it, to the DNA evidence. There's no corroborating DNA evidence in his home or in the car, et cetera. So it isn't that I'm ruling out that something that is positive for the defense could change all of our opinions. But at least as far as we know so far and what the prosecution has told us, the evidence seems to point toward Mr. Kogberger, sure.
Okay, so Jacqueline, if we back up a little bit here, there are 2 surviving roommates from that night, one of which had told officials that she had seen a man she didn't recognize that night, and the description that she had gave officials at the time fit Kogberger. The reason I'm bringing this up now is that we know that previously the defense had subpoenaed one of the surviving roommates to appear in court because they believe she had information that could be exculpatory to the defendant. I'm curious as to how you think the surviving roommates could play a role in this trial looking ahead to October 2nd. Do you think that they could potentially help Kogberger's defense?
Sure, help or hurt, definitely. But what we want to have is, because memory is so subjective and it's also susceptible to suggestion, and it fades over time, and it's just imperfect. And so it's important for people to get their stories out in a way that is not affected by the way the question's asked, et cetera, or any of the news media. When someone is a suspect in a case, there is naturally a suggestion for someone that they're thinking, well, this is the person the police think did it, it must be him. And that's really a subconscious thing going on in the minds of these witnesses. And so it's not unusual for the defense attorneys to be asking for these witnesses to be interviewed close in time to the time of the event so that you can preserve any possibility of reasonable doubt at the time.
Okay, so right now the trial is scheduled to begin on October 2nd. We also know the prosecutors here will be seeking the death penalty with this. What happens between now and then, and how likely or unlikely is it that we could see that trial date get pushed back?
It's very likely that the trial date gets pushed back. And what you're seeing is a precursor to what you're likely to see more of, which is more investigation, more work from experts to see whether the prosecution's theories hold up when you play them out. And so you're getting discovery, which is evidence that may be admissible in trial from both sides, and the exchange of that information, the information and reports from experts and investigators as this goes on. And so as it develops, both sides learn new things and give that information to the other side. Another side gets that information, does with it what they will, and gives them their response. And so that process takes time, and in a case where his very life is hanging in the balance, lawyers and experts and investigators are going to be quite thorough, hopefully, and that's what we're seeing here, that they're going to be very, very thorough when they look at all of this evidence. And so that October date is very likely to get pushed back.
Yeah. Well, Jacqueline, we appreciate you joining us here to help us understand everything that happened today or this week, this update that we're just learning about this week. Is there anything else here that we may not have addressed entirely that you would like to add on to, or any final thoughts here?
You know, I think we've pretty well covered it, but here's the thing. It's very early on, and Idaho is kind of an outlier when it comes to the deadlines for when the defense has to tell whether they're going to give this alibi defense. And so I think it's kind of an important aspect of the case that the defense lawyers said we may, and it would happen through cross-examination of witnesses against Mr. Kogberger and through potentially expert witnesses. So they're making sure to preserve Mr. Kogberger's right to remain silent and to have all of the panoply of safeguards that are attendant to him in these kinds of cases without losing their ability to put on an alibi defense if that occurs. And so that's kind of the way that defense lawyers in Idaho are dealing with that early deadline. And that's just an interesting aspect of this case to me. But it can change as time goes on. These lawyers are going to be amending their filings as they get closer to trial.
Yeah, Jacqueline, this can get complicated, so we do appreciate you joining us here to help us further understand all that is happening and what comes next from here. So thank you so much, as always, for joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
My pleasure. Thanks.